Hey guys, Justin here with JHart Modelworks. It is time to get started on the buddy build that we are doing with Mike from Mike's Miniature Motors. Now Mike and I are building the 1/24 scale Ferrari Monza SP2 from Alpha Models. So far this has been a great kit. There is a lot to get into with this though. There's a good deal of prep work and whatnot. So let's go ahead and get the camera flipped around and get to work. Alright guys, we are getting started on this body, and there are a couple of things I want to point out real quick. I mentioned these in the unboxing. There are a couple of little bits here. There's one here, there's one on each of these wheel arches. At first I thought these were flash, but talking to Mike sent me some photos of the actual car, and there's actually a trim on each one of these wheel arches. And this should be in a semi-gloss black. So once I finish painting, I'll probably do it after the clear, as the clear will protect the paint. I'm going to come back in with one of these display markers, and I'm going to paint that trim black with the marker. You could probably get away with just sanding that off and no one would really notice, but realistically that should be there, and it should be in a semi-gloss black. Another thing I want to point out, on the underside of the body where the dash goes, on the passenger side, there's this small lump. Now I used a Dremel and removed it thinking it was a defect or something. Do not do this. On the passenger side of the car is a small windshield, and this is the locating point for that windshield. Also, you want to do a lot of test fitting. I found on many of the parts some rough points. They are kind of like sprue points really, where they were pouring the mold. You can see there's one right there where these kind of stuck out, and I've sanded them down a bit already to get rid of the excess. We also have a little bit of flash here. We'll want to clean that up too. But you want to test fit your parts to make sure things will sit right and will fit correctly. Every now and then you may find something is warped. You may need to apply some heat to it to coerce it back into shape. So far I haven't found anything really major on this kit that's badly warped, but you do want to make sure that everything fits right before you paint it. Like this was actually sticking out a little bit on one side like this, because that pour point was sticking out enough that it kicked out one side. But once I got them sanded down and cleaned up, it all sits really well. So do a lot of dry fitting and sanding and cleaning things up. I've not washed anything yet. I figure since I'm going to be handling this a lot and, sanding on it and getting it contaminated, I'm going to do all the body prep first, and then I'm going to wash it with some Dawn dish soap when it's all done and get it good and clean. As there is mold release on this, there are places on here where you can actually see it. At least something is on this body. So you always want to wash cast resin parts before you paint them. There aren't any mold seams per se. Like on a regular plastic kit, there are the large seam lines where the molds come together. Alpha has really positioned everything on an edge, so you may see a little flash on the edges here and there, but nothing like a full body length line that you have to clean up on like a regular kit. I haven't seen anything on mine. All in all, it is very clean. We do need to clean up the panel lines. They are kind of shallow. You can see they're kind of shallow over here. Now I've already gone on this side and I've cleaned up all the panel lines on this side, but you can definitely see a difference between that and this side over here. Now I am using two different panel scribing tools. You have this one, this is the Tamiya engraving tool. This is the expensive one. The little bits are expensive, the handle is expensive, but it does an excellent job. For long, straight, and slightly flowing curves, this is a great tool for you. It really wants to go straight. When you start getting into these really tight curves, like the circle around this gas cap, that is where this comes in. This is the gum primer needle type scriber, and essentially all this is something like a 1/2 millimeter sewing needle in a mechanical pencil body. If you could find a 1/2 millimeter diameter needle and cut the eye off so it's just the shaft and run that through a cheap 1/2 millimeter mechanical pencil body, you could effectively have the same thing for a lot less money. But essentially, when it comes to doing these tight curves, this is a lot more useful as it doesn't have the hook to it, so it goes around curves better. You still want to take your time with this and go very slow. You want to be gentle and go really slow. You don't want to jump out of the lines at all. In my opinion, this resin body is a little harder to clean up than plastic. You just want to take your time, work around the circles several times. Now I've already done this, so I'm not going to do it over and over again, but you get the idea, just like this. Make sure it's nice and clean. It was also useful for doing the lines on top of these fairings because the hook is great for going in a straight line, but up here you're needing to rotate and twist the part because this doesn't really want to curve as well. But like I said, for these long straights or just gentle curves, the Tamiya will be a great tool for you. Now a lot of times your initial instinct is going to be to dig in hard and get that panel line cleaned out as quick as possible. That's really not what you want to do. You really want to go slow, be gentle, let the tool do its work for you. Don't put a whole lot of pressure on it. Get your line done 2 or 3 times, and once the line is defined, then you can put a little more pressure on it. But the more pressure you put on the tool, the more it's going to want to jump out of the lines and scar up the body. We'll do a few passes this way with it, and then I like to turn it around and go the other direction for a couple of passes as well. Now when I'm done, I'm just going to come in here with this old raggedy brush, and we're just going to brush that panel line clean, get all the dust and debris out of it. Another thing we want to do is check for flash. Like I said earlier, I found there was a little bit right here in this opening, and honestly I just kind of bumped it with my hobby knife and it all just fell right off. But I'm going to go in with my brush here and clean out any debris from the flash removal as well as my panel line scribing. So we are done with our panel lines at this point. Now this is not a panel line, this is actually a piece of black trim. This is eventually going to get some black paint in it. We aren't going to dig this out like a panel line though, because it's a bit wider than an actual panel line already. The next thing we want to do is look over the body for any kind of imperfections. Maybe there's a small lump at the casting. I know Mike had a small lump back here near one of his rear fairings that he had to sand smooth and clean up. I do not seem to have any on my kit. Sometimes with resin you will get little pinholes as well, where there may have been a small air bubble during the casting. Sometimes those will rise to the surface as it cures and it'll cause a small little pockmark or a hole. If you do find any, you will want to fill those. You can use CA glue, put a little bit of drop of CA glue in the hole, hit it with some activator, let it cure up and then sand everything smooth. Or you may use some putty, like Tamiya polyester putty or some epoxy putty. I wouldn't use the lacquer-based putties. I don't really care for them, especially since I use lacquer-based paints. If you use a lacquer putty like Tamiya or Squadron or Mr. Hobby, they'll cure and you'll sand it and it'll look perfect. You then go and spray your paint over it, and the lacquer thinner from the lacquer-based paint reactivates that putty, and the putty shrinks back from the edges, and then you end up with this very visible border all the way around where that putty is that you can't really fix. You can try sanding it and respraying it, but a lot of times it just reactivates again and comes back. So I try to avoid those putties if I can. The polyester putty and the epoxy putties don't seem to shrink back like that. We've got some Tamiya 1000 grit sanding sponge, and we have a little bit of water right here, and we are going to wet sand the body. This is called keying the body. I know a lot of guys out there, there's some really good modelers out there, much better than me. Guys like Tom from Scale Modeling Channel use 400 or 600 grit on here. I've had some really bad experiences with scratch lines coming back up through the body during my paint job, so I like to stick around 1000. All we're doing is we're just sanding the whole body down and putting a bunch of tiny little micro scratches in that surface. That's going to give sharp little edges for the primer to cling to, and that'll help that primer adhere better, especially seeing as we're going to be doing some masking later on to do some stripes. This will really help give that primer something to hold on to, and the primer is what your paint holds on to. Now these side skirts are one of those parts where you may find some warpage. I do have a little on mine, it seems. There's just a big gap here. Now we can push this and glue this in, but we're going to have a decal over this. This is going to be carbon fibered, so the strength is really only going to be as strong as that decal is. There's a good chance it'll rip off and come back loose. So the way we're going to fix this is we're going to take our heat gun and we're going to heat the resin up. We don't want to get it really hot. We just want to get it warm. and then just give it a slight gentle nudge. Less is more here, and it'll kind of bend itself. It's almost like a really stiff putty, and it'll bend pretty much right into shape. We're pretty close here. There's a little bit more right here by this joint where it's a little thicker, so we're going to heat this up a little bit more as well. Once again, just a gentle little nudge right here. Test fit it again, and that's pretty much perfect. Both sides of mine had to be fixed. The other side is actually a little bit worse, but they both fixed very easily, just like this. Alright guys, we are in the spray booth and we're going to be starting our primer. We're starting with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black, and this entire build we're going to be using the Harder & Steenbeck Infinity 2024 airbrush for everything. Now I have changed this up to the 0.44mm needle, and I've changed the camera angle. We're going to see if this works out a little bit better than some of my previous videos. Now all we're doing with the black primer, we're going to be doing all the outer trim parts, and we're also going to be spraying the inside of the cockpit area for the car, as the interior is a lot of black, a lot of carbon, and it's not going to look right with the white primer. So we're just going to do about 2 coats of the Mr. Surfacer Black, and then we'll mask this off in a little bit later. The rest of the body is going to be getting a white primer, and I feel this is going to be a little hard to paint in here after I've got everything painted up on the outside, so I thought it would just be easier to get this done now and then mask it off. I have noticed that the large paint cup on this airbrush is smaller than my other brushes still, so I do end up filling the paint cup up a bit more than usual. If you do not have blue tack in your arsenal, you really should get some. This stuff has several uses, from masking to holding parts for paint. I use it to hold clear parts like headlight lenses while I'm setting them in place. It is reusable. Even after you paint over it, you just ball it up, stretch it out, ball it back up again a few times, and it's ready to go again. I have a ball of this stuff on my desk that I've been using for about 5 years now. I just pinch a chunk off, use it, and then smash it back when I'm done. Now, like I said, we need to mask off the interior, but there are some complex curves and surfaces. I could mask this off with some Tamiya tape, but I think that the blue tack would be a lot easier. We're going to put a big chunk back here in the back and then just push it around, and it will fill in all the spaces. And with all the masking done, I put the body on the Tamiya paint stand and I pressed the posts down into that blue tack I have on the sides, and then I added a little bit more blue tack over the posts, and it held the stand in perfectly. So we've been doing a lot of handling to mask the body. We've got our Tamiya stand securely in place. Now we're going to use some UMP airbrush cleaner to remove the oils from our skin and any other contaminants from the body. We want to give the whole body a nice wipe down, but I messed up here. I should have used a lint-free cloth or a microfiber cloth instead of this paper towel that I had at the bench. After my first coat of primer, I found a bunch of small bits of lint all in the primer from this paper towel.
Oh no, lint! Oh no!
I also ended up somehow getting a hair in the primer too. I'm not sure where the heck that came from, but we're definitely going to have to sand this primer down and do some repairs before our next coat. We've loaded up some Mr. Surfacer 1500 white primer. We're going to be applying 3 coats, cut 50-50 with Mr. Leveling Thinner and spraying at 20 psi. We're going to start with the small bits that will be body color as well. There's really only 3. There's a small front bit for the front splitter and the 2 side mirrors. These are going to get all the same coats as everything else, but this will probably be the last time you see them. Then we're going to move on to our body. On that first coat, we're going to go all around the body on the under edge, getting all the undersides and the wheel arches, and then we'll just lay a nice smooth even coat all across the body. You may notice the spray booth is a lot cleaner. I've replaced the filter, I've replaced my paper lining, I've washed all the surfaces. We had some tiny black dots, which I think were paint debris from the previous builds of the Firebird and the Super Bee. I think they were coming off the filter. It hasn't been changed in a long while. Maybe it was from the sides, I don't know. I should have scrubbed everything down before I started this build. We also had some lint in the primer from the paper towel I used to wipe it down, and I even got a hair in it. So we let everything cure up, and then we sanded all the problem areas with the 1000 grit sanding sponge. And now we're going to re-wipe this once again with the UMP airbrush cleaner, and this time we're doing it right with a microfiber towel. Next, we're going to dust the body off with an anti-static record brush. And we're going to give it a quick blast of just air from the airbrush to be sure everything is clear. Now we're going to start by very lightly feathering in some primer into the areas where we sanded and building it up to fill in the bare spaces. Once we have those filled, we will mist coat over everything to blend it all in together. We gave that 10 minutes to gas off, we hit it with another full coat, number 2, and then after this, I was happy to see there were 0 areas where you could tell the first coat had been sanded and repaired. Everything was smooth, everything was evenly covered, and we could give it 10 more minutes and move on to coat number 3. And here's our third and final coat of primer. So the body has actually had a couple of hours to cure up. Usually I wait at least an hour before moving on from primer to paint or switching between paints, but we've been waiting a couple of hours because I've been waiting on my phone to charge. I use my phone to record my videos, and the charging and sync port tends to go out very quickly on my phone, so I end up having to use wireless charging, which is significantly slower. It's also another reason why I've been doing less build series videos, is having to wait for my phone to charge in order to build is very annoying. Now, I said in my review for the Infinity Airbrush that any paint with a really heavy metallic would probably have an issue with the 0.25mm needle setup in this brush, so I've been using the 0.44mm needle for all the primer, but I've been noticing I'm having to fill up quite frequently. Now, it may just feel like I'm going through a lot of primer, as the paint cup on the 105 Patriot and the Omni 4000 that I'm used to are noticeably larger than the cup on the Infinity, so maybe I'm just not getting as much product in the cup as I'm used to. But it really feels like I'm going through a lot of primer. Now, typically I use a Badger 105 for my primer brush, but I switched out the 0.5 needle for the 0.3 for the very same reason. The brush blew through a lot of primer very fast at 0.5, so I switched to the 0.3, and that's pretty much what I've been using. So I did a little test using the 0.25mm needle setup. We have a green coming up later that is very metallic, but it's not a large metal flake like a candy base, so I gave it a try and it actually sprayed out really well. I'm impressed with the 0.25mm needle setup. So we're going to switch down to it for the rest of the paint job and see how it goes. I will probably switch back up to the 0.44 when it comes time for the clear coat. I think that may give me a smoother finish, but we'll see. Now we are starting with Scale Finishes Ferrari Bianco Avis. This is one of Ferrari's default white paints. They have two that are very common. They have Bianco Avis and Bianco Fuji. Bianco Fuji is the color I really wanted it, but he doesn't have it. Now I could go get the paint code for it and he would mix it up for me, absolutely no problem. Scale Finishes does custom mix paints, but I already bought this. This is more of a base white than a pearl, but that's okay, as I have a plan to fix that later. So we've loaded this up into the airbrush. We're going to do about 3 coats of this at 20 psi, standard operating procedure. So here we go with our first coat. I may have mentioned it before, but we are also doing all the small parts, which there's really only 3. There's this little front splitter bit, as well as the 2 side mirrors. These are getting all of the same coats of paint that the body is, so that they will match up properly. And then we're going to move on to the body. You're just going to not see them in every single shot. We are putting our coat down nice and smooth. On our very first coat, we're going around all the edges and all along the underside to make sure we get good coverage. And then we'll put down a nice, smooth, even coat all along the body. Now you may notice that I go over the top of the body multiple times, and that's just due to all the angles for these fenders, as well as these 2 large fairings back behind the cabin. I want to hit these from all different directions to make sure I get good even coverage and I don't end up with any thin spots anywhere. Here we are back for coat number 2. Alright, and finally coat number 3. Now, if you're looking for like a basic white, this is a really nice color, but it's just not that pearl white that I'm looking for. This, as you can tell, is a very old bottle of House of Colors Snow White Pearl. This is an absolutely beautiful color. I'm very sad that Jameson doesn't carry this anymore. I reached out to him, but it seems that House of Colors is now charging a small fortune for this paint. There is an alternative that is House of Colors Silver White Pearl. It is more silvery than this, and it changes the tone to an almost silver, which is a little more than what I want. This is absolutely the color I'm going for, so we're going to use what I've got here. As usual, with our first coat, we're going to go around all of the bottom edges, and then we're just going to put a nice even coat all over the body. And once I get the paint down, I'm just going to do a crisscross coat across the body just to make sure that I don't end up with any noticeable stripes. This isn't as big of a deal with pearls as it is with candy, but it's still something that I tend to do as a force of habit. And here we are with coat number 3. I have no idea what happened to the footage for coat number 2. My phone didn't record any. But that's okay. I mean, this is white over white over white, so we'll just enjoy a nice clean coat of paint. Now we want to mask off for our stripes. This kit doesn't have the stripes that I want, and even if they did, they wouldn't be in the color that I want them. And I just prefer to mask off my stripes and paint them. The first, and in my opinion, most important thing to do with masking stripes is to get your center line down and get it straight. We have a really nice marker on the front end here for our center that is the raised surface for the hood ornament, but we don't really have anything here in the rear. Now we want to find a place where we can measure repeatedly and consistently. On a lot of cars like American Muscle, I'll use panel lines like the corners of the trunk for the rear or the front and rear corners of the window trim for the roof to get me a consistent point to measure from. For this car, we're going to use this recess for the center brake light. A good set of digital calipers are, in my opinion, one of the best tool investments you can make when it comes to scale modeling. Now, you do not need to go out and spend $175 or more for a set of Japanese Mitutoyo certified calipers for what we are doing. I've been using this set from iGaging for a few years now. They had a lot of really good reviews. They have been very consistent for me, and I think they were around $35 when I bought them on Amazon. Inflation is a thing, so don't hold me to that price, but you can get good calipers at a decent price. Always start by making sure you're zeroed out. Now this big side is for measuring outer diameter, so measuring around the outside of things, and the small side here is for measuring in between things or inner diameter. We want to be very gentle and not damage our paint, but we want to measure the distance between the insides of these two posts. I've got about 24.3. Divide that by 2 and we get it at 12.15. This little knob at the top locks the calipers in place so they don't move. And now we want to carefully hold these in place, and using a pen we're going to mark our center on the tape. Tamiya makes tape in several different sizes. They have a 1, 2, and 3 millimeter. They have a 6, a 10, and an 18 for the big stuff. Now you might think these are some odd choices, but you can get just about any size you want by combining these side by side. If you want, for instance, a 5 millimeter line, you could use a 2 and a 3. If you want a 7, a 6, and a 1. You get the idea. Now for our center line, we're going to be using some 2 millimeter because that is the width of this hood ornament, and it looks really good to me. We want to start by getting it lined up on this raised rectangle here, and then we want to carefully line it up all the way back to our mark that we made in the rear, making sure everything is nice and straight and even. Now this gives us a straight center line front to back that we can build upon for our stripes. We want to get everything tucked down nice and straight. I'm going for some 6mm wide stripes, so we're going to take some Tamiya 6mm tape and we're going to run it right up along the 2mm center line. It is important that we get this straight, that it sits right up along the very edge, but it doesn't overlap anywhere. Now this front section is nice and flat, so we're just going to put in a piece of 10mm tape right up next to that 6. Again, we want to get it absolutely perfect, straight in line, but no overlap whatsoever. We are going to be removing that 6mm tape, and we don't want to pull this up when we do. Now due to all the curvature with this rear fairing, instead of using a big piece of 10mm like I used up in the front, I'm going to start with a piece of 3. Because the smaller your tape is, the easier it will conform to curves like this. Now I started to record this, but I got interrupted repeatedly. I hit pause, and then I forgot to unpause when I came back to finish recording it. But you get the general idea. Now once we have both edges of our stripes done, we can remove the 6mm tape and move on from there. These panel lines could pose a real problem, as paint can very easily bleed under the tape here. So we're going to come in and very carefully we're going to cut the tape along the panel line and then burnish it in as deep as we can with our fingernail. We're going to do the same thing with this front panel line up here as well. We're then going to take a matching piece of tape and line it up as perfectly as we can along the edge of the existing tape, and we're going to push that into the panel line with our fingernail as well. This may not be perfect, but it should at least reduce the chances of paint bleed under here. We finished masking off our stripes. This purple tape you see here is 3M delicate surface tape. You can get it at Home Depot or Lowe's. It's a very low tack masking tape. It's very similar to Tamiya tape, but you can get it in 40mm rolls really cheap. It's not as adhesive as Tamiya tape is. It doesn't always adhere well on complex curves, but it is really good for masking off the large outer areas after your detail masking is done with your higher quality tape. Now for our stripes, we're using Scale Finishes Ferrari Verde Scuro. This is an absolutely gorgeous green with a beautiful metal fleck to it. Now this very first coat we put down, we want to keep it very light. We want to get it even, but we want to keep it to a very light mist coat. We do not want to hose down a lot of paint very quickly. If we keep this first coat light, it should seal up the edges of the tape without being able to run under it, and that in turn should help to prevent runs and bleed under when we spray our next slightly heavier coats. Now while spraying, you want to keep an eye on your tape. I did find that this corner over here didn't want to stay down. Now I did have some tape behind it, so I was okay, but you definitely want to keep an eye out for things like that. Alright, we are back for coat number 2. This one is going to be sprayed a bit heavier. We are going for a more solid, even coverage on this coat, but we are not going to spray it wet. With lacquer-based paints, especially these automotive grade paints, you never want to spray a wet coat. The thinners can be very aggressive and can damage your previous layers of paint. And we're back for our third and final coat. Again, nothing crazy. We just want to make sure we have smooth, even coverage the full length of the stripes. We've given this about 10 minutes to dry, and now comes the nerve-wracking part where we see if all that work masking paid off. Now the best way to remove masking tape is to get the edge right up against the paint line, bend it back over itself, and pull away from the paint. This will reduce the likelihood that you're going to rip paint up when you pull off the tape. Our stripes come out incredibly clean. I am very happy with how these turned out. However, we did have an issue. The ink pen I used when I was marking my center line on the tape bled through the Tamiya tape. We are going to need to clean this up, hopefully without damaging our paint job. Alright, so we are back at the bench. Now I used some UMP airbrush cleaner on a cotton bud and was able to just completely clean up that ink pen with no damage at all. Our lines came out nice, straight, and even. Those look fantastic. Now this front opening here is going to get a big piece of photo etch for a radiator, as well as another piece that's going to go over it for a grill. But I am going to come back in here with some flat black and just brush paint it in to clean this all up. Alright guys, that is going to be a wrap for this video. We got our primer down, we got all of our paint down, the stripes are looking fantastic. In the next video, we're going to knock out the decals for the body as well as all the external carbon. There is a lot of carbon on this car. We're also going to need to take care of our panel lines and possibly some trim in order to get this car ready for the 2K clear. So that is going to be it for me. Thanks for watching, guys. I always appreciate you watching the videos and hanging out and building with me. And if you made it this far to the very end, I appreciate you even more for sticking through this one, as it was definitely a long one. I hope you had a Merry Christmas. I hope the new year is fantastic, and I will catch you on the next one.